Malcolm Hayes had spent years working tirelessly to achieve his dream, a beautiful home in Ridgewood Heights, Georgia, complete with a private pool. For him, this wasn't just a luxury, it was a testament to his hard work and success. Owning a home in such an upscale neighborhood was an accomplishment, and having a pool was the cherry on top. But lately, something had been disturbing his peace, his neighbor, Karen. Karen was not the friendly type. She never greeted him, never made small talk, and certainly never acted neighborly. Yet for some reason she had no issue treating his pool like her own personal retreat. The first time Malcolm noticed her was early in the summer. He stepped outside one warm afternoon, expecting to enjoy the view of his backyard oasis, only to find Karen lounging on a pool float, sunglasses on, completely at ease, as if she belonged there. At first he thought he was imagining things. Maybe she had confused his yard for someone else's. Wanting to handle the situation politely, he walked over and calmly explained that the pool was private property. Karen barely acknowledged him. She didn't apologize, didn't seem embarrassed, and certainly didn't move. Instead, she waved him off like an annoying mosquito and continued sunbathing. "It's just a pool," she scoffed, not even bothering to look at him. "What's the big deal? We're neighbors." Malcolm was stunned. He had expected her to be embarrassed, or at least to acknowledge that she had made a mistake. Instead, she acted as if she had every right to be there. At first, he decided to let it slide. Maybe she truly didn't understand. Maybe it was just a one-time mistake. But it wasn't. Every few days, Karen would waltz into his backyard like she owned the place. Sometimes she came alone, other times she brought friends, laughing and chatting like his property was some public clubhouse. Malcolm tried to be patient, but his frustration grew. He reminded her, firmly yet calmly, that she was trespassing. But Karen always had an excuse. One afternoon, as she dipped her toes into the water, she smirked and shrugged. "This whole area was built for the community," she argued. "If you can afford this place, then I should be able to use it too." That statement sent a chill down Malcolm's spine. It wasn't just entitlement, it was the tone in her voice. It was the way she spoke, as if a black man owning something so nice was a mistake, as if he had something she believed he shouldn't have. Still, he tried one last time to reason with her. "Karen, I bought this house. This pool is private. If you want to swim, you can join a club or get your own." Her response was instant, sharp, and entirely dismissive. "That's ridiculous," she scoffed, standing up and grabbing one of his towels to dry herself off. Malcolm clenched his jaw. He had dealt with entitled people before, but Karen, she was something else, and he was quickly realizing that being polite wasn't going to be enough. Malcolm Hayes had dealt with entitlement before, but Karen was on an entirely different level. It wasn't just that she trespassed, it was the way she did it, the way she dismissed his ownership, like his success was a mistake that needed to be corrected. Her arrogance boiled his blood, but Malcolm wasn't one for rash decisions. If being polite wasn't enough, then he would make it impossible for her to keep invading his space. The very next morning, he took action. He installed a high-quality lock on the backyard gate, ensuring that Karen wouldn't be able to waltz in as she pleased. He set up security cameras around the perimeter, positioning them strategically so that every corner of his property was covered. And to make things even clearer, he put up a large sign, "Private property, no trespassing." For the first time in weeks, Malcolm felt a sense of peace. His home, his sanctuary, was finally secure. That peace lasted exactly 2 days. On the third afternoon, Malcolm was inside, enjoying a quiet moment with his coffee, when he heard a loud rattling noise from the backyard. His stomach clenched, he reached for his phone and pulled up the live security feed. And there she was, Karen. She was gripping the locked gate, shaking it violently, her face twisted in frustration. Her lips were moving fast, and through the microphone on his camera, he caught bits and pieces of her angry muttering. "Unbelievable! How dare he? This is outrageous." Malcolm exhaled sharply, watching her pace in front of the gate, her hands clenched into fists. Then she pulled out her phone. He already knew what was coming. Minutes later, the distant wail of police sirens filled the air. Malcolm's jaw tightened. She actually called the cops. The squad car pulled up to the curb, and Karen rushed toward the officers, waving her arms dramatically, like she had just escaped a crime scene. "Thank God you're here," she gasped, pointing wildly at Malcolm's house. "That man is threatening me. He locked me out for no reason." He's trying to intimidate me." Inside, Malcolm took a slow, measured breath. He had done nothing wrong, but he wasn't about to take any chances. He stepped outside, keeping his hands visible, moving carefully. He knew how these situations could go. "Good afternoon, officers," he said calmly, his voice steady. "What seems to be the issue?" One of the cops, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, glanced at Karen, then at Malcolm. "She says you threatened her," he said cautiously. Malcolm didn't even blink. "I haven't spoken to her today," he replied, keeping his tone even. "But I do have security footage." Karen's face twisted in rage. "He's lying," she shrieked, stepping closer to the officers. "He's been harassing me for weeks. He put up that lock just to keep me out." Malcolm reached into his pocket slowly, ensuring his movements were non-threatening, then pulled out his phone. "Actually," he said, tapping the screen a few times, "I put up the lock because she keeps trespassing on my property, and I've got the video to prove it." He held the phone out to the officer, who took it and watched in silence. The footage showed everything. Karen grabbing the locked gate, shaking it violently, her pacing back and forth, angrily muttering to herself. Her pulling out her phone, clearly before Malcolm even stepped outside. The second officer, a younger woman, leaned in to watch. Her eyebrows shot up, Karen's face drained of color. The older officer turned back to her, his expression firm. "Ma'am," he said, his tone sharper now, "this is his property. You don't have any right to be here." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But he's being unfair," she stammered. "He's trying to keep me out on purpose." Malcolm folded his arms, looking her dead in the eye. "Yes," he said flatly. "That's exactly the point." The officers exchanged a glance. Then the older one turned back to Karen. "If you set foot on this property again, you will be arrested for trespassing. Do you understand?" Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. For a long, tense moment, she simply stood there, shaking with rage. Then with a frustrated growl, she spun on her heel and stomped away. Malcolm watched her go, his jaw tight. He knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. She was the type to retaliate. But what she didn't know was that he wasn't done either. And he had a plan that would change everything. As Karen stomped away, her face flushed with fury, Malcolm Hayes exhaled slowly, watching her retreat. He had won this battle, but he knew better than to think the war was over. Karen wasn't just some annoying neighbor. She was the kind of person who saw herself as untouchable. Someone who had never been told no in her life. And now that she had been forced to face reality, there was no doubt in Malcolm's mind that she would try to strike back. But what she didn't know was that Malcolm wasn't done either. That night, as he sat at his desk, he thought about his next move. He wasn't a vindictive person, but he also wasn't about to let Karen get away with what she'd done. She had trespassed on his property, harassed him, and lied to the police in an attempt to have him arrested. If he had no security footage, things could have ended very differently for him, and that was not something he could ignore. The next morning, Malcolm dug deeper. He started simple, a background check. Nothing immediately stood out. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants. Just an average middle-aged woman who had lived in Ridgewood Heights for years. But Malcolm wasn't looking for the obvious. He was looking for the truth. So he kept digging. Using public records, old news articles, and local archives, he slowly started putting the pieces together. And what he found made his stomach turn. Karen's family history wasn't just ugly, it was rotten to the core. Her grandfather and great-grandfather weren't just members of white supremacist groups. They were leaders. They had organized rallies, led hate-fueled protests, and were even linked to violent crimes that had once terrorized the very same state where Malcolm now lived. The deeper he went, the more disturbing it became. Her parents had carried on the same mentality, funneling donations into organizations that actively fought against civil rights movements and equal opportunities for minorities. Karen herself had no direct involvement in any of these activities. But suddenly, everything made sense. The way she looked at him, the entitlement in her voice, the rage when he locked her out of something she had no right to. This wasn't just about a pool. This was about power, the kind of power that Karen was used to having over people like him. But this time, she had no power here. Malcolm sat back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. He could keep this information to himself. But what would that accomplish? Karen had tried to ruin his life over a pool she had no right to use. She had tried to use the police against him, knowing exactly what could have happened if he didn't have proof of his innocence. People like her didn't stop until they were forced to. So Malcolm made a decision. He called a local journalist, Samuel Reed. Samuel wasn't just any reporter. He was known for covering cases of racial discrimination, abuse of power, and social justice issues. If there was anyone who would be interested in what Malcolm had found, it was him. And sure enough, within minutes of explaining the situation, Samuel was all in. "You mean to tell me she called the cops on you for locking your pool, and her family history looks like this?" Samuel asked, incredulous. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Malcolm replied. Samuel let out a low whistle. "Oh, this is big. Send me everything you've got." Malcolm did just that. He sent the security footage, the public records, the family history, and a full breakdown of everything Karen had done. And just like that, the wheels were in motion. 2 days later, an explosive article hit the internet. The headline? Entitled Woman Calls 911 on Black Neighbor, Her Family's Dark Secret Uncovered. The article exposed everything. Karen's repeated trespassing, her blatant lies to the police, her disturbing family history filled with white supremacist ties and deep-seated racism. Within hours, the story went viral. Social media erupted. People shared the article thousands of times. News outlets picked up the story, and soon Karen's name, face, and actions were everywhere. People in the community turned against her. Her workplace was bombarded with calls demanding that they fire her. She had spent weeks trying to humiliate and harass Malcolm, believing she was untouchable. But now she was the one being exposed. And Malcolm? For the first time in weeks, he finally felt in control, because Karen wasn't just dealing with him anymore. She was dealing with the entire country. Malcolm had thought that after Karen's humiliating encounter with the police, she would finally back off. But he had underestimated her arrogance. Instead of avoiding him, she doubled down. Every time he left his house, he could feel her eyes on him. Sometimes she stood on her porch, arms crossed, glaring as if daring him to say something. Other times he'd catch her muttering under her breath, shaking her head like he was some sort of criminal who had done her wrong. It was clear, Karen wasn't done, and neither was he. Malcolm had dealt with entitled people before, but Karen? She wasn't just entitled, she had a mean streak and a twisted sense of ownership over things that never belonged to her. And worst of all, she had no shame. That night, as he sat at his desk, he came to a decision. If Karen was going to make his life difficult, maybe it was time he learned a little more about hers. At first, it was just a basic background check. Nothing unusual, no arrests, no criminal record. But Malcolm had a gut feeling that there was more. So he went deeper. He combed through public records, old newspaper archives, even ancestry websites. And what he found made his stomach turn. Karen's family history wasn't just problematic, it was a legacy of hate. Her grandfather and great-grandfather weren't just members of white supremacist groups, they were leaders. High-ranking figures in one of the most notorious branches of the KKK. Old black and white photos surfaced, men dressed in full white robes, standing beside burning crosses, their faces filled with hatred and power. Newspaper clippings linked her family to violent rallies, arson attacks, and even unsolved hate crimes from decades ago. But it didn't stop there. Karen's parents had carried on the legacy in their own way. While they hadn't worn the robes, they had poured money into white supremacist organizations, actively supporting racist policies and segregationist protests back in the day. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Now it all made sense. Karen's rage at him locking his pool, her outrage that he had something she didn't. It was never about the pool, it was about power. In her mind, a black man owning something so nice was a mistake, something she had the right to correct, because she had been raised to believe that people like him didn't deserve success. Malcolm's jaw tightened. She had tried to weaponize the police against him. She had lied to get him in trouble, and if he didn't have security footage that day, she might have succeeded. He couldn't ignore this. People like Karen thrived on control, and they never stopped until someone forced them to. So Malcolm made a decision. This information wasn't going to sit on his computer. He needed to expose her, because Karen wasn't just some petty neighbor throwing a tantrum. She was a product of something much worse, something that had been festering for generations. And if she thought she could make his life miserable without consequences, she was about to learn a hard lesson. Malcolm grabbed his phone and made a call, because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure Karen never did this to anyone else again. And he was going to make sure the world knew exactly who she was. Malcolm Hayes exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the desk. He had all the proof he needed, but sitting on it wasn't an option. Karen had spent weeks trying to make his life miserable, and it was time she faced the consequences. Malcolm had never been the type to seek revenge, but this wasn't about payback. This was about accountability. Karen had tried to use the police against him, lied to get him in trouble, and trespassed on his property repeatedly. And now, with the disturbing truth about her family history in hand, Malcolm realized something. Karen had never faced consequences a single day in her life. That was about to change. Malcolm made a call, not to the police, not to a lawyer, but to Samuel Reed, a journalist known for exposing racial discrimination and abuse of power. "I've got a story for you," Malcolm said, his voice steady. Samuel listened intently as Malcolm laid out everything: Karen's repeated harassment, her false accusations, and most importantly, her deep-rooted family ties to white supremacist groups. "You're telling me," Samuel said slowly, "this woman called 911 on you, tried to paint you as a threat, and her family has this history?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. Send me everything." Malcolm did just that. And once the wheels were in motion, there was no stopping what came next. The next day, an expose dropped online. The headline: "Wealthy woman calls 911 on black neighbor, her dark family's secret exposed." The article detailed everything: Karen's history of entitlement, her weaponization of law enforcement, and the shocking truth about her family's past. At first, it was just a local piece, but then it spread like wildfire. Social media erupted. People shared it thousands of times. National outlets picked up the story, and Karen? She was furious. Malcolm was watering his front lawn when he heard angry footsteps storming up his driveway. Karen, phone in hand, her face twisted in rage. "You did this!" she screeched, waving her screen at him. "You're trying to ruin my life." Malcolm didn't even flinch. "I didn't ruin anything, Karen," he said coolly. "Your family did that all on their own." Her breathing grew heavier, her hands shaking. "That's all lies," she spat. "My grandfather was a war hero, not some—" She stopped mid-sentence, but it was too late, because Karen's downfall had only just begun. Malcolm kept his stance firm, his voice calm but sharp. "Keep telling yourself that, Karen," he said coolly. "But the truth's out there now, and people aren't happy." Karen's breathing grew heavier, her entire body shaking with rage. She wasn't just angry, she was desperate. And then, in one final reckless act, she sealed her own fate. Karen lunged at him or at least she tried to, fueled by pure rage but slowed by her weight. She barely got 2 steps forward before her foot caught on the uneven pavement. She stumbled hard, arms flailing, and just as she was about to regain her balance, red and blue lights flooded the street. The police had arrived. It turned out Karen had been making threats online ever since the expose dropped. She had taken to social media, spewing hateful messages, vowing to retaliate against whoever had exposed her. Someone had reported her behavior, and the authorities had been keeping a close eye on her. As soon as the officers stepped out of their squad car, Karen panicked. "This is all fake," she screamed, pointing wildly at Malcolm. "He's trying to make me look bad. I'm the victim here." But the officers weren't buying it. And when they moved toward her, she did the one thing no one expected. She ran. It was almost comical. Karen, red-faced and sweating, trying to outrun trained officers. She made it barely 20 feet before her foot caught on the curb. She crashed hard onto the pavement. Within seconds, she was surrounded. "You're under arrest for making false reports and attempted assault," one of the officers said as they cuffed her. Malcolm just stood there watching. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. Karen had spent her entire life believing she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. Today, that finally changed, and he had made sure of it. The courtroom was packed. Reporters sat in the back whispering as they jotted down notes. Local residents filled the benches, some of them Malcolm's neighbors, eager to witness the proceedings unfold. Malcolm himself sat calmly near the front, his arms crossed, watching everything. Then the door opened and the judge entered. Karen's breath caught in her throat. The judge was black. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. She had spent her entire life looking down on people like him, and now he was the one deciding her fate. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood as Judge Elijah Carter took his seat. He was a tall, composed man, his sharp eyes immediately landing on Karen as he shuffled through his papers. Finally, he looked up. "Miss Reynolds, you are being charged with trespassing, filing false police reports, and attempted assault. How do you plead?" Karen swallowed hard. Her lawyer nudged her, whispering something under his breath, but she barely heard him. The room was hot. Too many eyes were on her. She could feel sweat trickling down the back of her neck. "Not guilty," she muttered, her voice cracking. Judge Carter didn't react. He simply nodded and turned to the prosecutor. "Proceed." The next 30 minutes were brutal. The prosecutor laid out everything. Karen's history of harassment, the false 911 call, her online threats, and of course, the moment she tried to run from the police. Witnesses, including Malcolm, took the stand. Security footage of her throwing a tantrum by the pool was played for everyone to see. Karen squirmed in her seat, her face shifting from red to pale. Then Judge Carter spoke. "Miss Reynolds," he began, his voice steady, "I have to say your actions are some of the most brazen examples of entitlement and discrimination I have seen in this courtroom." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, but the judge wasn't finished. Karen clenched her fists, her breathing uneven as Judge Elijah Carter continued, his voice unwavering, his gaze locked onto her with the weight of absolute authority. "You repeatedly trespassed onto private property, harassed your neighbor, attempted to manipulate law enforcement for your own gain, and when confronted with the consequences of your actions, you resorted to violence and deceit. This court has reviewed the evidence, including multiple witness testimonies and irrefutable security footage, and it is clear that you acted with blatant disregard for the law, for justice, and for the rights of others. You weaponized your privilege, believing you could bend reality to your will, and when that failed, you turned to aggression and fabrication. You, Miss Reynolds, are the very definition of entitlement without consequence, and today, that finally changes." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, no words coming out, her entire body trembling as the weight of his words sank into her, but she wasn't ready to give up just yet. "This isn't fair," she finally spat, her voice laced with venom, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table as she leaned forward, her face twisted in fury. "This whole thing is a setup. She jabbed a finger in Malcolm's direction. "Provoked me. He's making me look bad, and you're just letting it happen because you're—" The courtroom collectively gasped as she bit back the last word, her face turning an alarming shade of red. But everyone in the room knew exactly what she was about to say. Judge Carter, however, remained unfazed, his expression unreadable as he set his pen down, exhaling slowly before speaking again, his tone dropping into something almost dangerously quiet, yet filled with enough weight to command absolute silence. "Miss Reynolds, if there was ever a sliver of doubt about your intentions, your words today have erased them. Your utter lack of remorse, your refusal to take accountability, and your willingness to insult this court only reinforce what we already know. You do not believe rules apply to you, but let me assure you they do. Therefore, I find you guilty on all charges, and in addition to the standard penalties for trespassing and falsifying police reports, I am extending your sentence due to your attempted assault and your blatant disrespect for this court." Karen's eyes bulged, her entire body jerking forward in disbelief as her lawyer hissed under his breath, trying to calm her down, but it was too late. "No, you can't do this!" she shrieked, her voice climbing into hysteria. "You're just another—" Bailiffs moved swiftly as she thrashed in place, but she wasn't done fighting, wasn't ready to accept that for the first time in her life, there was no escaping the consequences of her actions, no convenient excuse, no privilege that could shield her from the reality that she had been caught, exposed, and ultimately undone by the very person she thought she could destroy. She barely got 2 more words out before they pulled her back, cuffing her hands behind her as her screams echoed through the courtroom, sheer rage spilling from her lips in unintelligible fury. Malcolm watched it all unfold, his face expressionless, his hands resting calmly on his lap, not out of satisfaction, not out of triumph, but out of the quiet understanding that justice, true justice, had finally arrived for someone who had never once believed it could touch her. As Karen was dragged away, her voice still shrill and defiant, the judge gave one final nod, tapping his gavel sharply against the bench. Court adjourned. With that, the room erupted into murmurs, reporters scrambling to finalize their notes, locals whispering among themselves about how they had never seen anyone fall from grace so spectacularly, and Malcolm simply stood, inhaling deeply before making his way toward the doors, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air, feeling the unmistakable weight of peace settling into his bones for the first time in what felt like forever. Karen was gone, and she wasn't coming back. The downfall of Karen is more than just the consequence of her actions. It is a stark reminder that privilege without accountability eventually collapses under the weight of truth. Throughout her life, Karen operated under the belief that rules were for other people, that she could manipulate situations, weaponize authority, and evade responsibility simply because society had never forced her to face real consequences. She trespassed, harassed, and falsely accused an innocent man, all while believing she was untouchable. But in the end, truth, justice, and accountability prevailed. This story teaches us that entitlement, when left unchecked, can blind a person to their own downfall. Karen could have walked away, apologized, and learned from her mistakes. But instead, she chose to double down on her arrogance, convinced that her reality would always be dictated by what she wanted rather than what was right. For Malcolm, the lesson is one of resilience, patience, and the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. He never sought revenge, never stooped to Karen's level. He simply protected himself, gathered evidence, and allowed the truth to work in his favor. In a world where false accusations have destroyed innocent lives, Malcolm's decision to remain calm, document everything, and let the facts speak for themselves was the smartest and most effective way to fight back. His experience highlights the importance of always being prepared, knowing your rights, and never underestimating the power of proof. Beyond the individual characters, this story reflects a larger truth about society. The days of unchecked entitlement and abuse of power are coming to an end. In an era where cameras are everywhere, where stories can spread across the world in seconds, and where communities are more willing to stand against injustice, people like Karen no longer get to operate in the shadows. The lesson here is clear. If you refuse to change, if you refuse to take responsibility for your actions, the world will force you to face the truth, whether you like it or not. This is not just a cautionary tale about one woman's arrogance. It is a warning to anyone who believes they are above consequences. Eventually, justice comes for everyone.